Good evening. Welcome to Highland Park Presbyterian Church, where history and innovation have long been a part of our community spirit. My name is the Reverend Quincy Worthington, and I have the honor of serving as pastor here at Highland Park Presbyterian. And today, this evening, we gather to celebrate a remarkable milestone. It's the 150th anniversary of Elisah Gray's groundbreaking broadcast into this sanctuary. Elisah Gray, a visionary inventor, scientist, and Highland Park resident, is widely recognized as one of the pioneers of modern communication technology. And though often remembered for his development of the telephone, Gray also made history on December 29, 1874, by transmitting sound using his harmonic telegraph, an invention that demonstrated the ability to send musical tones through wires. This demonstration, conducted right here in the original sanctuary whose foundations we are literally sitting on this evening, was not just a local marvel, but a glimpse into the transformative potential of human ingenuity. Gray's work was far ahead of his time, and he laid his own foundation for innovations in communication that have shaped the world we live in today. His experiment here was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a moment when faith and technology intersected to inspire a sense of wonder about what is possible when creativity and perseverance come together. And so this evening, as we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, we welcome everyone, whether from Highland Park or beyond, whether here out of curiosity or out of a passion for history and innovation. This is a moment for all of us to celebrate a shared heritage and the extraordinary achievements of the human spirit. And so let us, with open hearts and minds, honor Elisah Gray and his contribution to our shared story and the enduring call to connect and create for the good of all.
Thank you, Reverend. Numerous people pointed out to us when we began talking about this event that this church was not the church where the event took place. This church was dedicated in 1911. But a church is a community, and this church community began in 1871 above Chase Bank, where the Presbytery formed the Presbyterian Church and had their first baptism, and built this church, which opened in 1874. The church bought the land in 1873, right before a great long depression in this country, and they had a savior to help pay for the mortgage, who paid it all. Okay, can't hear me? Should I start over? Sure. Okay, sorry. Okay, can anyone hear me now? Okay, well, welcome to this sesquicentennial. And I wanted to point out that when we first started talking about this event, many people pointed out to me, well, it wasn't in this church was dedicated in 1911. And that's true. But a church is a community, as I learned growing up in the Presbyterian Church. And this community began in 1871 on the second floor, where the Chase building is, in a different building again. And they had their first baptism, they met with the Chicago Presbytery, and the land for this church right here was bought in 1873. Unfortunately, in 1873, in September, there was a massive crash that led to a depression, a long depression. And they had a savior to pay down the mortgage, and that was Mr. Gray. So, welcome, and I would like to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Jeff Stern. Mr. Jeff Stern is a fifth-generation Chicagoan, and he has always felt obligated to give back in some way service to the city that enabled his family to prosper after his grandfather made it his home upon his arrival from Germany in the mid-1850s. Growing up on the near north side, an early interest in the operations of the fire department led to his visiting firehouses in every Chicago neighborhood, usually on public transportation, the CTA, by the time he was 13. He was also deeply affected by the Second World War, which didn't end until he was almost 10. After college, he worked briefly for the Chicago Sun-Times before being drafted for 2 years into the Army, where he served stateside. Returning to the newspaper, he was assigned a number of beats and spent a year working for the correspondent of another newspaper. He later moved to Washington, D.C., where he ultimately served in public affairs in the newly established Environmental Protection Agency. Meeting his future wife, Jean, on Capitol Hill, and settling in Georgetown, they moved back to Chicago in 1971, where he and his wife raised a son and a daughter, and he eventually served in media relations with the CTA. Before retiring in 2003, he joined the boards of 3 organizations associated with the history of Chicago and Highland Park community. One of them is us, the Highland Park Historical Society. And he's going to talk about someone else's community service.
I hope you'll forgive me. I'm in practice to be an old person. Highland Park has attracted a lengthy list of entrepreneurs and professionals since its incorporation as a city in 1869. But no municipality has come as close to being recognized well beyond this North Shore community as being the home of one of the foremost inventors of modern times. It was Elisah Gray who developed, and in the nation's centennial year of 1876, attempted to secure a patent for the device that became known as the telephone, but not before Alexander Graham Bell managed to obtain acceptance for originating another similar device of his own. The event we commemorate this evening was Gray's initial effort to demonstrate the potential for his device in 1874. According to the Patent Office of the United States government, in the final year of President Ulysses S. Grant's administration, quote, while Gray was undoubtedly the first to conceive of and disclose the invention, as in his caveat of the 14th of February, 1876, his failure to take any action amounting to completion until others had demonstrated the utility of the invention deprives him of the right to have it considered, unquote. What became known as the telephone was by no means Gray's first invention. About a decade after studying at Oberlin College, which was to the north of his birthplace in the town of Barnesville, Ohio, Gray developed what he called a self-adjusting relay, which was an instrument that automatically regulated the motions of the telegraph sounder. 3 years later, he and his associate, Enos M. Barton, founded the Gray and Barton Company in Cleveland to provide telegraph equipment to the Western Union Telegraph Company, which was the predecessor of the Western Electric Manufacturing Company. Renaming their enterprise the Gray Bar Electric Company by combining both names, they moved their operations to Chicago in 1870. After the Great Fire, a year later, Gray and his wife Delia decided to settle in recently incorporated Highland Park, which was several miles north of the big city that had just been left in ruins. After residing temporarily in a hotel in the city center, the Grays chose to purchase a house recently built by the Highland Park Building Company nearby at what is now 461 Hazel Avenue. The property included several acres with gardens and 2 artificial ponds to the north. Their move to a scenic, smaller community along Lake Michigan appealed to a growing number of families that were determined never again to endure anything resembling the devastation caused by the fire of 1871. It was facilitated by the expansion of train service that had started more than a decade earlier, enabling those who lived well beyond the city's borders to reach jobs there within a reasonable amount of time without having to provide their own means to get there. Besides devoting most of his creative life to the perfection of systems of communication by electricity, Gray, as we have learned, became an active and very generous member of the church that occupied this same site 150 years ago, and whose mission has been carried on by the parishioners of the 21st century. And as we have also learned, the financial crisis of 1873 left the church owing $6,000 for what was then its new building, which Gray himself covered with a donation of that amount. While Gray's loss of official recognition as the inventor of the telephone deprives our community of what we might consider bragging rights, to this day, we still have physical reminders of his presence here. The bank-like structure at 1811 St. John's, for instance, once housed Gray's first telephone exchange. And while it is now used for offices, the red brick building on the northeast corner of St. John's, on the northwest corner of St. John's and Elm Place, originally served as Gray's generating plant, which powered the first electric streetlights that he placed in operation in his adopted hometown. For those who may never have thought of Highland Park as a manufacturing town, it should also be noted that the factory built to house Gray's electrical enterprises stood just west of what are now the tracks of Metra's Union Pacific North train line, north of Gray Avenue, along what is now part of Ridgewood Drive. Among the inventions he did actually get patented were for the telautograph and burglar and fire alarm systems. Gray was by no means the only accomplished innovator to join the exodus northward from Chicago after the fire of 1871. Architect W.W. Boynton, who designed the iconic Chicago Water Tower and pumping station, among other significant structures, found refuge in our city, where he designed the predecessor to the church, where Gray performed the experiment we commemorate tonight, and he was elected mayor in 1874. Recognizing the importance of keeping traffic, including emergency vehicles, moving through while passenger trains were stopped at the downtown Highland Park train station and crossing gates were down, Boynton is credited with creating the underpass at Laurel Avenue that allowed east-west traffic to continue through. He also designed homes for a number of local citizens, such as the magnificent 1890 Queen Anne-style residence of Palmer A. Montgomery that still stands at 2480 Sheridan Road. So anyway, that's my word, my contribution for the evening. I tell everybody, if they know their history, they can tell when I was born. It was the year England had 3 kings.
So like when the event happened 150 years ago, the demonstration was at the end of the concert, and we're happy to have a virtual presentation by Professor Roderick Knight from Oberlin. He taught ethnic music courses at Oberlin for 32 years, and he developed the Knight revision of Horpstilsax, a system for classifying musical instruments. He also maintains a blog about organology and the collection. He's a great interest in the musical instruments built by Elisah Gray, who studied at Oberlin. As honorary professor of dynamic electricity, he taught. Gray's instruments were the first in the world designed to produce sounds by electricity and to transmit these sounds via telegraph to remote locations. One could say that Professor Knight was the first technology in music and related arts professor.
Celebrate an event that took place 150 years ago in Gray's lifetime, 1874, on this day. It was a concert, and at the end of the concert, he presented a musical instrument that he had invented and built that produced sound by electricity and transmitted it by electricity. Quite an achievement, especially this early in the history of the world. So I'm in front of a showcase that I put together of things that I built, replicas that I built of Gray's musical instruments. The actual instruments are at the Smithsonian. We're fortunate to have them there, and you can see them and measure them, but you can't hook them up. So in order to hear something, I needed to build replicas, and we're going to look at some of those and listen to them as well today, in an attempt to replicate what happened 150 years ago. So let me begin a presentation here that will zero in on those things. This is an image of Oberlin. Oberlin is important to the Gray story too, because before moving to Highland Park in the 1870s, he had been a student at Oberlin College. He met Delia Shepard, his wife, there. She was a music student. And they both attended First Church. This is the building, still standing. It was built in 1842. And I'm just using this slide to get us in the right frame of mind here. So the roads were dirt back in the 1870s. There were boardwalks to keep your shoes clean. People traveled by horse and buggy. There were electric devices, but no electric lighting. There was no recording device. Edison's cylinder recorder came along a few years later. There, of course, was no telephone or radio. If you wanted to hear music, you had to make music. And yet Gray was going to demonstrate how you could hear music without seeing what was going on at all. So we'll have a look at some of the things that he did. Here's a picture of him from approximately that time. I think it's a little later, a few years later. And in 1874, the Presbyterian Church, which was a very new institution itself, put on a concert, which you've heard part of today. And at the end of the concert, we had Elisah Gray's presentation. So I have another version of the concert poster here, and we'll zero in on the bottom of it. We're going to hear the electric telephone, by means of which a number of familiar melodies transmitted from a distance through telegraph telegraphic wire will be received upon violins and other instruments within the room. What in the world was he talking about? This is a panel from the showcase where we see a violin, a box, and a keyboard, some other things there. Let's start with the violin, since he talked about using this in the concert. This is a famous picture of him with his violin. You can see it's quite different from your usual violin. It doesn't have ordinary strings. It has a metal plate in their place, and it's also hooked up electrically. Let me give you a little better view. My colleague and friend Ian McMillan is holding a replica that I built here. Well, it's an old violin, but I modified it the same way Gray did. And you can see here electrical connection. The other connector is in the player's hand. So he's putting himself in the circuit, actually. And by stroking the plate with his fingers, he reproduces the sound that's coming over the wire. How in the world did Gray come up with such an idea? Well, in the 19th century, it was fairly common in households to have a device like this. It was an electromagnet, and it produced a tone and gave a vibratory effect in the wands that you held on a sore spot, powered by batteries, of course. And Gray was in his home in Highland Park, the building that's still there, and he heard coming from upstairs a very loud sound. What was happening was his nephew was playing around with this electrotone. He hooked it up to the tub and to himself in the usual way, and when he rubbed his fingers on the tub, he got this amplification of the little device here. This was quite revelatory for Gray. It was really the beginning of his exploration of transmitting sound by wire. Even though we have this replica of the violin, it didn't actually work, I'm sorry to say, so I can't give you a demo as he would have done at this concert, but we'll move on to the other things that he worked on and eventually hear what he played. He abandoned the violin fairly quickly himself because it actually hurt a little bit to put your hand in that circuit. So he came up with what we now call loudspeakers. The term wasn't common then, but this could be described as the world's first loudspeaker. It's a metal bowl with electromagnets pulling on the center of it. If you hook it up to a circuit with music on it, you hear it. This did work. I've heard a sound off of this loudspeaker. I won't play it today. It's a little tinny, you might imagine. More of interest is the pine box loudspeaker that he built next. This is an exact replica. The working parts were made by Mike Miller. He's a machinist in the physics department at Oberlin. And I built the box. And the way this worked was the electromagnets pulled on a metal bar that was mounted on the face of the instrument. So that was the diaphragm of the loudspeaker. And this is what the audience saw at the Presbyterian Church. The very item that they used is at the Smithsonian today. Now, I made a recording of a piece of music on the instrument that he used to produce the sound, and I'm going to play it for you now. Unfortunately, I don't have a video of it, but actually that's very fitting because you, sitting in the audience 150 years ago, were not going to see anything except this pine box with sound emanating from it. So here's what that sounded like. I chose a Christmas tune because we're still in the Christmas season. accomplishment in itself. So this would have been the end of the concert. Well, they played more than one tune on the instruments. I'm sure that Gray invited anyone who wanted to see what was actually happening to learn the mystery. And so let's go to that subject next. Here's the very keyboard with me trying it out at the Smithsonian. White gloves to keep it clean. And of course, not hearing it, they didn't look it up, but this is what it looked like. This is the very one that he used at the Highland Park concert. Inside, we can see how it works. So you've got the 8 keys. It's just a diatonic instrument. The black keys were just painted on for reference. You've got an electromagnet for each key, and behind the magnet, a bar, metal bar, that is tuned to produce the sound. So Oberlin's replica looks like this. Again, 1 octave. Under the cover, we can see how this one works. The electromagnets here are mounted up high. This is, again, Mike Miller's creation. And behind the electromagnets, we'll look at the back here, are the bars. Each one is cut away, you see, so that it vibrates when you pull on the top of it, which is what the electromagnet did. So the one with the heavy weight here is going to produce a much lower sound, and then notice the weights get smaller until the highest note, which doesn't need a weight on it. So this is a rather raucous instrument. It's very buzzy and noisy. You kept the lid on, or you can put the moving parts in the case somewhere out of the way. The whole point was to transmit that sound. And at the top of the reeds were sensors that picked up the vibration of the reed and sent it over the telegraph wire. That's how it worked. So what happened next in Elisha Gray's life? Well, back in 1874, we didn't know what might happen, but now we do. He pursued the subject a bit more. You could say he sort of moved into the big time. 3 years later, he staged a very gala concert at Steinway Hall. It's kind of the predecessor of Carnegie Hall. 2,000-seat auditorium, Piano Company's headquarters. And the program was produced, so we know what pieces were played. It was the same idea. He was telegraphing his sound to the concert hall. For this, he built a more elaborate keyboard. This one has 16 notes chromatic. All the keys there operate. And the moving parts, the electromagnets and the bars, are in a case elsewhere. And he hired a pianist to play this, Mr. Boskovitz here. So here he is with the keyboard and the pine box loudspeaker so that he can hear it nicely. The moving parts, the noisy parts are in this case here. And this man sat in Philadelphia while the audience was in New York. Western Union had strung a line between the two cities. It's about 90 miles for the Centennial Exposition the year before, in 1876. So they used this line again for this concert. And it was quite a success. Here's the audience sitting in Steinway Hall. The inset up here shows the new loudspeaker. It's a set of boxes, resonant boxes, with a reed inside each one to replicate the sound that was being produced by the instrument in Philadelphia. Here's another picture of him talking about that event, explaining that, yes, it's sitting on the piano, but you're not hearing the piano. It's just for extra resonance. There's a man in the picture here, too. We saw him in both of them. He's the telegrapher communicating with the performer in Philadelphia. And that was the only movement you saw on stage for this big concert. Gray put on more concerts like this elsewhere in New York and in Washington, D.C., and finally at a concert in Oberlin in 1878. It seems that he abandoned musical activities after that, because imagine trying to build an 88-note keyboard that would satisfy a pianist. It was quite an undertaking, so he moved on to other things. But since we have the capability now to hear any sound we want, my electronics friends and I worked out what we thought these pipes might have sounded like. And I asked my colleague, Claudia MacDonald, musicologist and pianist, if she could play the tunes that were listed in the program there on 16 notes of the keyboard. And she agreed. And so we're going to be able to hear what we think this version of the musical telegraph sounds like. Here's a tune from that program. So I hope when you hear electronic music now, or go to a concert where you're hearing music over loudspeakers and there's nobody actually visible, you'll remember that it all began with Elisha Gray in Highland Park.
If anyone has any questions, we're happy to answer them and entertain them. Amy?
Just to clarify, so my understanding is that the 1874 event was not being received by an audience outside of this building. He was doing a music production and then showing these
Correct.
events that he had done. And then it was a couple years later that he actually did his Skyline Hall and they sent it over wires.
Correct.
So we saw the showing rights.
It was sent from the house next door, the Sewell Weston House, which it was the house next door, which was previously was the rectory, and we call it the Soul House now. It's also where the photographer Edward Weston was born. So yeah, it was from that house to here.
So he wasn't showing just the instruments, they were hearing it.
They were hearing it from the house next door. Yes. Anyone else? Well, thank you for coming out on such a cold night this evening. We appreciate it.